Hello everyone, and welcome to the first ever webinar in the International Institute for Sustainable Development Sustainability Showcase, where we will be regularly highlighting research and analysis from IISD's programs. My name is Lasse Toft, and I'm a development officer with IISD located in our office in Geneva. With me today in Geneva are our presenters today, Peter Wooders, IISD's Group Director for our Energy Program, and Richard Bridle, Project Researcher with the Energy Program, and who also work with IISD's Global Subsidies Initiative. I'd also like to welcome IISD staff joining from our office in Winnipeg, Canada today. This is Carla Sibrucki and Charles Thrift, who will be assisting with the webinar. If you have any technical problems, and hopefully you won't, they'll be able to assist you. If you need to get in touch with them for assistance, please email them at the addresses that should be appearing in your webinar chat or message box in a moment. So I was very pleased when I looked over the registration list to see that we have attendees from a variety of organizations and multiple countries, and even from several continents. More than 60 people signed up for the event, so we're very pleased for that, and welcome to all of you. Before we start, I'd just like to briefly introduce our speakers today. The first one being Mr. Peter Wooders, Group Director of Energy here at IISD. Peter Wooders leads our energy program, which supports countries move to and deepen the sustainability of their energy system. The program includes our Global Subsidies Initiative, and supportive work on fiscal policy, including the green economy, IISD's work on climate change mitigation, and a pillar focusing on sustainable electricity systems. The next speaker today is Richard Bridle, who is project researcher here at IISD and key author of the report we're going to look more into today. And Richard has a background in the renewable energy industry with experience in policy analysis, project management, development, and procurement. The webinar is scheduled to run for approximately 1 hour and will also be recorded and made available on the IISD's website. Before I give the floor to Peter and Richard, I'd like to just go over a few quick ground rules before we begin. I'd like to ask everyone to please keep their microphones off during the webinar. If you don't know how to mute the microphone on your computer, that's okay. We can do so on our end with the webinar controls. Also, we would like to we will have a question and answer session after the presentations. And if you do have a question, I ask that you please type it into the chat window. My colleague Carla Sibrucki is typing in it right now, and you should all be able to see the message momentarily when she posts it. You can type questions in at any point during the session, but we will wait to answer content-related questions until after the presentation. What we'll do for the Q&A is that Carla, Charles, or myself will read out the questions you typed rather than have you turn on your microphones, because in our experience, not all microphones work automatically with the webinar system. Instead, we're happy to relay your questions aloud to our presenters so that they can answer them. And with that, I'd like to give the floor, the virtual webinar stage, to Peter Wooders and later on Richard Bridle.
Well, hello everybody. Pleasure to be on the call this afternoon. And I think if there is one question we at the Global Subsidies Initiative have been asked most often over the past few years, it is the title of the report today. It is, what is the impact of fossil fuel subsidies on renewable electricity generation prospects and deployment? As ever, trying to answer this question is both a little bit more difficult than we might expect at first sight, and it also leads us into a wider set of questions, and there's a need for, as ever again, a wider analytical framework. So essentially, we know that comparing relative subsidies, or some would even call them incentives, given to fossil fuels for electricity generation and to renewable technologies for the same purpose is only part of the wider debate. And the debate really is about what should be our future electricity mix. And I've put a slide up here on Vietnam's future electricity mix from its Power Development Plan 2011 to 2020. It's an official document. And here we'll see, in this particular example, that they expect over 50% of their power to be coal-fired and less than 10% to be renewable. Now, is that a good solution, and what role do subsidies have within that? I think this debate also leads us into what we want our electricity systems to achieve. Clearly, we want supply to be secure, we want investment for increased demand or even for increased access in some countries. We want to see jobs created, we want industrial policy to lead to world-class companies, we want local and global environmental issues to be managed, and we want, ideally, and this is some of the debates that are coming up in Europe and other places at the moment, healthy utilities and healthy fiscal parts of the electricity system. So it's sort of this part, it's this debate that IISD's energy program has put central to its mission. This is an extract from our website just to introduce to those who don't know us. Our energy program has three parts. We're looking at climate change mitigation, at subsidies through our Global Subsidies Initiative, and then through our electricity pillar. And we arrived at our views on today's issue really from two of those work streams. The first was GSI's ongoing work to establish the scale and impact of fossil fuel subsidies, particularly the scale. And then in many countries we've seen, particularly in the Middle East, North Africa region, that those subsidies are extremely significant and could be a major part of subsidies in general. The next slide I've got here is from a study we did a few years ago, it's still relevant, which shows the gas price in the red there across a 12-month period, 2008-2009. And then on this from this graph, it would be essentially cost-effective at about $5 per MMBTU for wind to be cost-effective with gas in the country. So where was the gas price? What was the price being paid by Egyptian power generators in 2009? You'll see as this falls down, it falls down right to the bottom. It was $1 per MMBTU. It was lower than any price on the world market throughout that 12-month period. And within that particular context, clearly the subsidy to natural gas was the major barrier to wind power in Egypt. As we go through, the other angle that we've used from our work as well is to look at the electricity system side. And we recognize and would promote that a financially sustainable electricity system is absolutely essential for development, and that's development writ large, i.e. sustainable development. The subsidies that we can see in that system can occur as fossil fuel subsidies to generators, they can occur as subsidies to renewables, and then there's also often subsidies in terms of cheap loans or credit or loss write-off to the electricity system, to the utility, and often some of that can get fed back into particular generation solutions, particularly fossil fuels. And we've coined the concept of the financially sustainable electricity sector. It's on this next slide. A system must be able to meet demand, it must be able to recover its costs, it must be able to make investments, and it must be able to comply with environmental and social norms. And we think that this framework has been very useful in order to assess the central question that we have today, the impact of fossil fuel subsidies on renewable electricity generation. Now, I've been walking through our sort of journey to this point to some extent, and it's not just a way to show off our work and to be proud of the team and what they've done here. I think it's also because, and one of the reasons we really wanted to do this webinar today was because we understand that to make influence on the electricity mix of tomorrow, on how subsidies are put through, whether they're supported or challenged or not, requires us to act in collaboration, in coalition. We're too small to affect this issue on our own, and I would venture that everybody's organisation on this call today is also similarly too small. So if we move on to the specifics for today, we're launching our report jointly in Lima, in the COP, and also here today on this webinar, the impact of fossil fuel subsidies on renewable electricity generation. And I'd like to introduce now, with pleasure, Richard Bridle, my colleague, and I look forward after his presentation to what we hope will be a very lively and stimulating conversation. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So thanks for joining us. So welcome to this webinar on the impact of fossil fuel generation on renewable energy. So I'm looking forward to having the opportunity this afternoon to discuss the work that we've been doing at the GSI of the IISD
and also discussing fossil fuel subsidies and renewable energy more generally in the Q&A session following the presentations. So my name's Richard Bridle, and as Leslie said, I'm a researcher at the Global Subsidies Initiative of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. My background is both in the renewable energy industry, working on projects such as wind farms and biomass power stations in the development and design and economics of those projects. So I am going to be taking you through the work in this area and specifically discussing this new report which came out this week. So the presentation that I'm about to give will provide a good overview of our work and our thinking in this area, but I'd certainly recommend that you take a look at the report, particularly to follow up with references and for a more detailed discussion of some of the issues that I'm going to cover here. So, as Peter explained, the impact of fossil fuel subsidies on renewable energy has become a very hot topic, and one we're certainly asked about on a regular basis. It's widely recognised that fossil fuel subsidies have negative impacts on renewable energy, but there's not too much published research on this. So one of the drivers for this piece of research was that we've seen many examples of people raising the issue that the level of subsidies provided to fossil fuels is significantly greater than the subsidies provided to renewables. So the image shown on the screen is from the campaign group 350.org, and is quite powerful, I think, just showing fossil fuel subsidies compared to renewables and then declaring that a fail. So while this is certainly important to raise the issue of fossil fuel subsidies, it doesn't tell us too much exactly how we should react to this information, and specifically what actually the impacts of the fossil fuel subsidies are on the renewables, aside from a difference in magnitude. So what we really wanted to do was to conduct a piece of research that brought together some of our experience to discuss the actual impact of the fossil fuel subsidies on renewables. So I hope in this presentation I can give a bit of a more detailed picture of some of these relationships. So what I'm going to cover in this presentation, firstly we're going to look at a few definitions. We're going to explain the term subsidies and discuss whether that's necessarily a negative term. We're going to look at three aspects of fossil fuel subsidies on renewables. We're going to look at the impact on cost competitiveness, the impact on incumbent electricity sector companies, and the impact on investment decisions. So we'll then talk about external costs in the electricity sector, and finally we'll discuss some conclusions and next steps. So one way of conceiving of the definitions of subsidies is to think of it as a Matryoshka nesting doll. So in this illustration, the elements that everyone agrees are subsidies are at the centre of the doll, and as we move outwards, we have elements which are not necessarily subsidies, or maybe some definitions don't include them as subsidies, but they still have an influence on the electricity sector and the electricity mix that Peter mentioned. So in this representation, we still can't hear the webinar. Okay, sorry. Okay, fine. So I'm going to keep going. I understand that some people are having technical problems, but are resolving them, so I'm continuing. So at the centre of the doll here, we have budgetary spending and tax relief, including payments and transfers. These could be payments from the government to companies, such as grants. We also have foregone revenue in the form of tax breaks. When a government provides a lower tax rate to a specific industrial sector or activity, this is counted as a subsidy under almost all definitions. So government also provides subsidies in the form of purchasing goods or services above the market rate, or selling goods or services below the market rate. So an example of this is the provision of fossil fuel subsidies as an input to the electricity sector at prices which are below international prices. So as we move to the third stage of the doll, there seems to be less agreement. So market price support mechanisms and such as consumption mandates, which guarantee a market for a particular good, are not necessarily included under a strict definition of subsidy, but under other definitions they are counted. So that's where we come into a bit of the grey area. And then finally, in the outer level, we come onto externalities. So externalities are not generally included in definitions of subsidies, yet society must bear the cost of these externalities. For example, air pollution leads to societal costs in the form of health impacts, so respiratory problems and others, and these are not covered by the costs of those are not covered by those practicing the activities. So it can be argued that these are, if not exactly subsidies, act in a similar way by providing electricity sector companies sort of free access to something that society must bear the cost of. So on the next slide, I'm just going to, so there's a few definitions around. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but we have the World Trade Organization's Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. The International Energy Agency has got its own definition. We as a GSI have got various definitions and discussions of that in our documentation, and the OECD also apply their own definitions. So for more discussion of the definitions around fossil fuel subsidy reform, I'd invite you to refer to the guidebook on fossil fuel subsidy reform, which is pictured on the slide there, and you can find that on our website. There's also various other publications that discuss some of the different methodologies for estimating subsidies and defining them. So before we move on, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of the electricity sector. So Peter covered this to a degree, and I'm just going to revisit it before we move on. So the graph here from the IEA's key world energy statistics shows that since 1970 to now, fossil fuel and fossil thermal power is the kind of dominant and the norm within the electricity sector. So if we can see fossil fuels as very much the incumbents in the sector and the status quo of the electricity sector. So when we consider renewable energy policies and analysis of fossil fuel subsidies, that's the kind of starting point. And finally, it's just to note that estimates, there's many estimates around for subsidies, but a key one that I think many people refer to is that from the World Energy Outlook published quite recently. So $548 billion in 2013 of consumer subsidies to fossil fuels, and $121 billion to renewable energy. So I'm not going to dwell on these figures too much, but just to include them for completeness. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to cover is just the question of, are subsidies good or bad? Do good subsidies exist is the question here. So the term subsidies has negative connotations. When people want to describe subsidies that they view as being justified, they often use the term incentive, which expresses kind of a value judgment on the subsidy. Since we are applying a kind of objective or neutral definition to the term subsidies, we're not using the term in a negative way. We're stating a fact that under this definition, we can classify certain spending as subsidies. Now, clearly, in many cases, subsidies do have negative impacts. They're often very costly and often fail to meet their intended objectives. And they may have significant unintended consequences. So, however, whether a subsidy is considered to be good or bad, it must be assessed by considering the objective of the subsidy and whether it meets these objectives at a reasonable cost. So, we like to separate the kind of the value judgment as to whether the subsidy is kind of worthwhile or justified. And we do that by considering 3 steps in subsidy analysis. And those steps are identify, measure, and evaluate. So we can both identify subsidies and measure them before we have to come up with an evaluation of whether they're justified or not. Okay, so now to move on to kind of the main part, we've set the scene, and to move on to the main part of the presentation on what the impacts of fossil fuel subsidies on renewable energy are. I'm just going to start to summarize some of the subsidies we've seen in practice and some of the subsidies we're going to discuss in this section. So this is not an exhaustive list, and it mainly draws from experience from working on the electricity sector subsidies in projects in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as through our work in Indonesia and Canada. So first, on the top left of the diagram, we have the provision of inputs to the electricity sector at below market rates. So this is often in the form of regulated prices for fossil fuels. Next, we have direct payments to the electricity sector companies to cover losses or otherwise support the activities of the electricity sector companies and maintain or enhance service provision. In the top right of the diagram, we have market price support, which comes through the form of regulation of electricity tariffs. And then at the bottom, we have foregone revenues in the form of tax breaks, such as tax breaks to exploration for producers and reductions in corporate taxes for generators. So infrastructure is also important for generators, particularly in the form of the electricity grid. Providing cheap grid connections and transmission services is another form of subsidy, as it's a provision of goods or services below market rates. And then finally, we note here that externalities, one not a subsidy, also play a role in influencing the sector. Okay, so now we're going to run through some of these examples in more detail. So first of all, subsidising fossil fuel inputs to the electricity sector. So this is kind of quite a significant one, I think. So the prices of inputs to the sector are often regulated. One example of this is the use of national fuel purchasing organisations to import or procure fuel and sell it to generators and other users. So often the price paid is either the international price or the prices for local production. The sale price does not necessarily reflect the price paid, as governments may regulate these prices to satisfy other objectives. So sometimes this may begin as a price stabilisation fund, just to kind of smooth out the peaks and troughs in market prices. But then as prices trend upwards and it's politically difficult to raise the sale price, subsidies may build up. So subsidies are effectively kind of meeting the difference between the costs of purchasing fuel and the sale price, which is achievable. Okay, so the impact of subsidising fuel inputs to the electricity sector is that generally the wholesale prices fall, wholesale electricity prices fall, as generators see a reduction in their operating expenses and they're able to sell their output at a lower price. So for renewable energy generators who don't receive this kind of subsidy, they may see a power price in the wholesale market that they're unable to obtain. And many renewable generators don't sell electricity directly into the wholesale market, but they have a power purchase agreement, or PPA, and the wholesale price is kind of used to explicitly or otherwise influence the price of a PPA. So the downwards overall pressure on power purchase agreements and wholesale prices creates a barrier for renewable energy. So the next element we're going to consider is funding the losses of electricity sector companies. So sometimes electricity companies may have the prices at which they can sell electricity regulated by the government. If the regulated sale price is lower than the cost recovery price, so what they need to kind of cover their costs and their margins, then this leads, they have a choice really. They can make losses, they can cut back perhaps by underinvesting in plant or equipment for the future, or they face a deterioration of the service as maintenance needs go unmet. So to prevent this loss of service quality and to protect investors, governments may decide to cover these losses. So this is often started in response to a specific external shock. For example, a sudden price spike which is caused by the expiration of a contract for inputs, or a physical interruption to a supply of low-cost fuel. And then after a price shock, unless costs fall back very quickly, or prices rise, then losses may persist and the government may be committed to providing subsidies to bridge the gap. So we're just going to look at an example of this now, which is NEPCO in Jordan. So in 2009, supplies exported from Egypt and imported into Jordan were dramatically cut by around 75%. So that low-cost gas had helped to keep costs down in Jordan for many years. So in response to this, the national electricity company, NEPCO, were forced to switch to other fuels to meet the demand for electricity. and that meant the increased use of heavy fuel oil and diesel. So these fuels were expensive and led to significant losses in NEPCO. The government decided to step in to cover these losses to maintain investment and service levels. The losses have been running at around $1.5 billion per year. In response, the government now plans to raise electricity prices every year between 2013 and 2017 to reach a point at which the subsidies are no longer required. These also, as a measure of social protection, these prices these price rises won't be implemented for vulnerable groups, which include those who consume the least electricity. So these kind of payments, which are generally made to established companies, may prevent new renewable entrants from entering the market, as it may not be possible to compete without receiving similar payments. So it should be emphasised that in the case of Jordan, it's not exactly the case, as the losses have been kind of confined to a single entity rather than spread out around a number of electricity sector companies. So in Jordan, all other electricity companies have been able to continue to operate at cost recovery levels. Okay, so next we're going to talk about tax breaks, so government foregone revenue. So tax breaks act to increase the profitability of certain activities. Of particular relevance to the electricity sector is exemptions or reductions in excise duties on fossil fuels for electricity generation. When these fuels are used for other purposes, including road transport, excise duties are payable, but these aren't fully applied to the electricity sector. Since renewable generators don't use these products, they do not receive similar subsidies, which places them at a competitive disadvantage. So tax breaks are often also applied for special sectors. For example, investment in coal power plants has been designated a special activity in Turkey, which is designed to promote the construction of additional generation plants. Tax codes can be very complicated with many categories at different rates for different activities. So each of these rates is established by a combination of calculation and political determination, which means that well-established and influential sectors of the economy are likely to be able to influence this process and secure tax exemptions and reductions that aren't available to new entrants, which may include renewables. So the next aspect we're looking at is called reducing fiscal space. And we use this term to describe the kind of room for manoeuvre that governments have when deciding on spending priorities. So where fossil fuel subsidies make up a significant proportion of government spending, this reduces the ability of government to commit to discretionary spending on other activities. In the Middle East and North Africa, there are 12 countries which spend more than 5% of GDP on fossil fuel subsidies. In some cases, this is more than the spending on education, health and defence combined. This places a huge burden on the public budget and makes it difficult to allocate resources for other projects. A transition to an alternative electricity system in which renewable energy and distributed generation is likely to be more common will require investment in infrastructure. These investments are very difficult to make in the context of very constrained public finances. So to give an example of this, we'll look at the case of Indonesia. So in 2013, Indonesia spent approximately $9 billion on electricity subsidies, which is 8% of the entire government expenditure. The subsidies in Indonesia came about as the country switched from being a net exporter of oil to a net importer. As this happened, instead of consuming domestically produced oil at a price that was lower than international prices, they started to have to pay the full international price for imports. There's always an opportunity cost of it consuming oil rather than exporting it, but at the point Indonesia became a net importer, this opportunity cost became a real financial cost. So if Indonesia was not spending 8% of its total government spending on electricity subsidies, it could reallocate these funds for other programs, which could improve investment in the enabling conditions for a more sustainable electricity sector, which would include a greater role for renewables. So the next aspect is access to non-fuel inputs and infrastructure. So the provision of services other than fossil fuels at subsidised prices, so below market rates, may also benefit fossil fuel-based electricity sector companies. Construction and provision of access to an electricity grid that supports fossil fuel use constitute a subsidy in the form of provision of services below market rates. In addition, provision of low-cost access to cooling water is also a subsidy. So one study estimated that provision of cooling water in Australia amounted to a subsidy of 27 million Australian dollars. So electricity grids typically have evolved over time in response to a paradigm which involves a small number of large generators close to population centres, and also allowing for access to transport, cooling water and the other needs of the sector. But electricity grids in the future are likely to involve a larger number of distributed generators, perhaps with some generators concentrated around renewable resources rather than just population centres. In addition, it will include new technologies such as demand-side management, smart grids, and potentially energy storage as well. So subsidies to non-fuel inputs and infrastructure act to maintain the current system in its current form, and these prevent new entrants such as renewables from developing projects because they don't have access to these same services that they need to develop. The political economy of the electricity sector. So one of the key reasons why subsidies exist and why electricity sector policy favours incumbents is that the electricity sector exerts an influence on the political system to protect their interests. This political economy of the sector is important to understand how policy, including subsidy policy, develops. Generally, politicians respond to public opinion as well as special interests and investors. In the case of the electricity sector, those with a direct relation to the sector, including employees of electricity sector companies and those involved in related activities, will engage and feel strongly about reform. So this effect is particularly concentrated in regions where there is a significant proportion of employment that relates to electricity production. That could include mining as well as those directly working in power stations or construction. Industry groups that are funded by the electricity sector incumbents are also more able to fund efforts to communicate directly with politicians, to make them aware of their issues and concerns and the potential impact on their businesses. New entrants often don't have the resources to make these kind of representations. So investors also act to protect their investments and avoid the creation of stranded assets. And all of these factors act as a barrier to change and a barrier to new entrants entering into the market and act on the brake of developing renewable technologies. To enable the development of renewable energy projects, the conditions must support investments in these projects. The presence of subsidies effectively makes fossil fuel projects more profitable to investors, as subsidies act as an additional form of income. In the figure shown here, the impact of fuel subsidies sorry, I think I've got the wrong note here. Yes, sorry, it's here. So in the figure shown here, the impact of input subsidies is shown graphically. A subsidised generator can generally outcompete an unsubsidised generator, leading to a more attractive investment. The presence of attractive investment opportunities for fossil fuel projects disadvantages products that do not receive these subsidies. This is likely to include renewable energy. In addition, there are subsidies that specifically target investment, and these include enhanced capital allowances, so allowing capital assets to be written down over a shorter period, low-cost loans, and sovereign guarantees. So the problem here is that the investor's interests may not necessarily be aligned with society's. The investor cannot consider the cost to society as a whole of their investment. So even though the total cost of providing subsidies and paying for the output of the fossil fuel generators may be greater, the investor can only consider the project in terms of profitability. So governments must attempt to make sure that the regulation makes investor interests align as closely as possible with society's interests. So as an example of some of these schemes, the Regional Investment Incentive Scheme in Turkey provides an interest rate support of up to 5%, and in addition, the Turkish government has provided loan guarantees to coal power stations. So this leads to this leads to capital that could otherwise be allocated to renewable energy projects being instead allocated to fossil fuel projects, and can create a lock-in as infrastructure, which it will endure for decades, is installed. So the presence of high fossil fuel subsidies can also undermine the financial sustainability, the concept that Peter referred to earlier, of the electricity sector, which can increase uncertainty and deter investment. So now I'm just going to talk briefly about external costs. And external costs are the costs of the environmental and social impacts associated with an activity. And they're not charged to the producer, but experienced by society as a whole. So for fossil fuel generation, these include air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. Ideally, internal cost mechanisms can be introduced to build the cost of these activities and the cost of the impacts of these activities into the cost of doing businesses. That's by achieving that, the interests of society can be factored into financial decision making. This is a form of market failure when the externalities are not included in the cost. So and that's the argument for building in new mechanisms that force businesses to take account of these costs. Environmental fiscal reform promotes the use of the fiscal system to address this imbalance. And it's a relatively complicated concept, but simply it includes the polluter pays principle, and also the idea that beneficial activities such as the creation of employment and the provision of services that are necessary for development should be taxed less, whereas activities that are harmful, such as emissions to air and water, should be taxed more. And by shifting the tax burden away from beneficial activities to harmful activities, we can achieve a more sustainable electricity sector without increasing the overall tax burden. So, since we've established that subsidies promote, or fossil fuel subsidies promote unsustainable activities, and in some cases actively prevent renewable energy and a transition to a sustainable electricity system, in many cases they should be phased out. However, in practice, reform is very difficult. GSI have developed a guidebook summarising our knowledge of subsidy reform, which covers the main aspects of successful reforms. So we don't have time to go into this in detail now, but if you're interested, I suggest you download a copy from the website. So our conclusions from the presentation. So the amount of subsidies allocated to fossil fuels compared to the amount allocated to renewables is less significant than the impact of those fossil fuel subsidies. In this presentation, we've covered some of the major impacts of the subsidies on renewable energy. I'm sure there are many others. I hope our future work and the work of our partners will build on this. Fossil fuel subsidies impair the competitiveness of renewable energy, reinforce fossil fuel-based systems, and impact investment decisions. The first best solution is to remove fossil fuel subsidies where they're in place. Beyond subsidy reform, the pricing of external costs can help to address market failures. And finally, our next steps. So where we want to take this work, we'd like to do more work at the national level to analyse the real impact of fossil fuel subsidies on renewable energy at the national level, and this means more in-country work, building on the previous in-country work we've done in Indonesia, MENA and Canada. So we'd also like to develop partnerships and collaboration to evaluate the impact of these subsidies. We plan to build this into the next phase of the Global Subsidies Initiative, which will be starting next year. And we'd certainly be interested to hear from others who are interested in supporting us and working with us. And finally, to download the report, you can find it on our website, and there's a link there. But you can find it through the IISD and GSI websites. So thank you very much. And there's just another plug again for our website to download the presentations. And I'm going to hand back to Lasse now as we go into a few questions.
Thank you very much, Richard, and also thanks to Peter for this interesting presentation, and also thanks to all our attendees. I hope that the few sound problems we had in the beginning were solved. We will now turn to a brief Q&A session. And thanks for all the many good questions that have come in during this presentation. I think we're just gonna go straight to it and begin with a couple of questions here. Richard, have you already studied at the DSI in any case that increasing the price of fossil fuels to the market level, to what extent can that stimulate the renewable energies production?
So the answer to that question is we have looked at it. We did some work looking at the GCC, the Gulf region, which looked at the impact. One of the proxies we used to measure this was looking at the impact on the wholesale price that removing fossil fuel subsidies would have. And in many cases, the impact is quite significant. I think Peter's graph at the beginning was a good example of that in Egypt, where the prices for the fossil fuel inputs were so low that it really made a huge difference to electricity. I think that's certainly an area where we'd like to do more work in future to cover that in some detail. We've done preliminary calculations, but I think that really looking at that in detail would be a great focus for work in the future.
Okay, thanks. And in kind of the same, a related area at least, one of our attendants is concerned that even pricing fossil fuels at the international market price, does it really matter that much?
I think it certainly does matter in some countries. When we look at MENA, in many cases, the cost of inputs to the electricity sector can be only 10% or 50% of the international price, and that can have a huge difference to the electricity sector. But certainly, it's not necessarily the only thing that will make a difference to the sustainability of the electricity sector, and that's really where externalities come in as well as the next step. I think pricing carbon, pricing air pollution, and also pricing emissions to water, so that the true costs of electricity generation are reflected in the prices is really important.
Okay. And another question. The analysis expects that if the fossil fuel subsidies are eliminated, that would also allow the elimination of the renewable resources subsidies.
I think in a perfect world where all externalities are priced in, then you wouldn't need additional subsidies. Subsidies are very much not a first best solution. Pricing externalities, so having a realistic price on carbon is a much better solution, is a first best solution. And renewable subsidies are a second best solution, but in many cases, subsidies are more achievable. So if you're looking at the immediate term, what can be done to improve the sustainability of the electricity sector, subsidies to renewables are politically achievable. And so I think that's why they're used, and I think that's why they're here to stay for some time. They also meet objectives of the kind of industrial policy as well. I think that many countries want to build renewable industries and want to create green jobs. So renewable subsidies are used for that purpose as well.
Okay. Another good question here is that it's a clear challenge to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies is the power of industry lobbyists. In your opinion, do you think that the renewable energy sector tried to kind of enter the fray and use their power to help the push, and if not, why?
They certainly have. I was involved a few years ago in a project called RE Communicates, which was funded by the IISD, which looked at communication around the renewable sector. And we work with organisations like the trade associations, the European Photovoltaic Association, and the EWEA, the Wind Association. And So the efforts are definitely there, but I don't think they're necessarily at the same scale as some of the fossil fueled kind of industry associations. And I think that's it's kind of reflected in the size of those industries. It's as we talked about in the presentation. The incumbents, which are very much kind of dominating the electricity sector, naturally have not only kind of more financial resources, but also bigger constituencies of people who are kind of involved with them in the production and processing of fuel. And that's going to remain a problem. But I think that's where kind of research and NGOs and other organizations all kind of have a role to play in influencing that debate.
Okay, thanks. And then a question regarding the current situation with relatively low oil prices. What role would low oil prices play at all in terms of removing some of these fossil fuel subsidies in many countries? And how would that impact the renewable electricity generation?
So I think it's an incredibly important time when fossil fuel prices start to fall, because while it's very difficult to cut subsidies as prices rise, as prices come down, subsidies can be removed in percentage terms without the price at the pump or the price of electricity going up. And so it's a good opportunity to review subsidies. I know that many governments have been kind of planning for these kind of moments where it's possible to remove subsidies, but that still doesn't solve all the problems. So I think it's kind of it's an opportunity, and certainly if you can remove fossil fuel subsidies, it will have an impact on renewable energy. It may not be enough on its own to kind of push renewable energy into viability everywhere, but at the margins it certainly has an effect.
Okay. I'm just going to take one more question and probably a few more. We still have about 10 minutes before we have to really wrap up. Another question is pricing climate change and health externalities is well established, but water externalities seems more difficult to monetize. Any advice on how to price those?
Well, I think lots of countries have got different models, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but I know that abstraction of water is regulated, and really it's a case of kind of what is the resource, what is the impact of the activity. The ideal price for pricing any externality is by relating it to the environmental costs of the activity. So I think analysis looking at what the impact is, looking at the value of that resource for other activities such as agriculture or the cost of processing that water. And I think it's the role of research really just to kind of try and put some factual basis behind the charging calculations. And I think that you have to come up with a rational basis for your pricing strategy, and that requires research to work out what that should be.
And speaking of research and the methodology used in the report, how easy would it be to apply some of this at a country level?
I mean, I think that was really at the front of our minds when we started working on this, and the reason that this report came about was it was kind of summarising things that we learned through doing some country analysis. And Peter also mentioned the concept of the financially sustainable electricity sector, and we really see analysing how electricity sectors function, both in terms of the subsidies that drive different decisions, the performance, the service delivery, and the investment that's happening as all being part of a very connected picture. So I think that we certainly intend this kind of analysis to be done at the country level. And in many ways, it's only really useful at the country level because defining in general terms certain types of subsidies that have certain types of effects don't tell you very much about what's going on in a particular country. So really, certain subsidies will be important in some countries and not in others. And it's important to kind of really look down at the detailed level, national level, to work out which subsidies are relevant.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Another question, quite straightforward. The report, is it mainly about producer or consumer subsidies?
So the report is mainly about consumer subsidies, although there are elements of work on producer subsidies there too. So for an example, the influence of what producer subsidies do to the market is they lower the cost of production, which effectively makes more production viable, which ultimately lowers the wholesale price of those commodities. So that will act providing a downwards pressure on the market price. If you're talking about a very small country that's procuring its from the international market, the impact will likely be relatively small. But at a cumulative level, producer subsidies are important on the global market. So producer subsidies certainly do have an impact on the prices of commodities.
Okay, thanks. Another question is, there seems to be a lot of discussion and pressure on divestment from coal. Is this at all related to your study?
Yes, I think it is. So, as we kind of alluded to at the beginning, there's a discussion at the moment, a tension between what the electricity mix of the future is going to look like. And to some extent, that's a decision between coal versus renewables. I think coal is kind of, in the absence of any externalities and often in the presence of subsidies, coal is often the cheapest type of electricity generation available at the moment. And renewables are, while they're viable in many places, it's not necessarily the cheapest option everywhere. So I think that the role of subsidies and subsidy reform, and also the pricing of externalities, in making a shift in the electricity mix to tip it over from a situation where coal is the default option to one where renewable energy plays a greater role, is really at the heart of this debate.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that was the last question we have time for today. But thank you all again for all your good questions, and thanks for signing up for this webinar, which will hopefully be the first of many. I would just like to remind you that if you would like to revisit some of the discussion points or the slides or the talking points, the webinar was recorded and will be available on IISD's website. You can also see on the slide Richard's email and the Global Subsidies Initiative's website, and you're more than welcome to contact us if you have any questions or if you're looking for any additional information about these issues. That would be all from us today. Thank you very much for joining, and have a very nice evening, morning, or afternoon, depending on where you all are. Thank you.